Hi, I'm Sue Bergamo, and welcome to Short Takes. Today, we're doing something a little bit differently. I have Chris Hetner with me, who is ex SEC and currently independent consultant. We're going to talk about the SEC cyber disclosure rule today. Chris, thank you for joining Short Takes. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for having me today, Sue.
Let me start by asking you the following question. You originally wrote the document in 2018 that was the precursor of the cyber disclosure rule. Can you tell us what was the original premise of that document?
Yeah, so let's back it up a little bit. Yeah, I've been in the cyber arena for roughly 30 years. Majority of my time was oriented towards supporting Wall Street financial services firms. I was a global CISO for GE Capital when we were an actual $500 billion business, and I had an opportunity to go serve within the SEC as senior advisor to the chair's office. So I was named as senior advisor to both Chair White, Mary Jo White, as well as Jay Clayton. So I spent just over 4 years in the executive branch. And in 2018, we issued interpretive guidance as to how cyber disclosures should manifest. What's really the substance, the content, the frequency around cybersecurity disclosure. And my team within the chair's office was really a sounding board on behalf of corporate finance. So corporate finance is the division, the policy division that creates all the policies and rules, and it serves as a tee-up for the chair's office to evaluate its efficacy and its relevance. So we pulled data sources from various types of constituencies. The CISO community. Obviously, I was a former CISO. I spent 20 years in Wall Street. Very tight ecosystem. We worked with the legal community. We worked with the compliance community. We basically, pulled data and insights from the big consulting firms. What are we seeing out there? And we worked very closely with the boardroom community through the National Association of Corporate Directors, where I now currently serve as their senior cyber risk advisor across our 23,000 board member community. So we try to collect data from various aspects of the community, kind of a 360 view. And really the premise behind the 2018 interpretive guidance was to drive cybersecurity more as an enterprise risk management issue, bring it upstream to the C-suite, including the chief risk officer, the general counsel, the CEO, the enterprise risk management function as a whole, and prioritize the investment and spending on cybersecurity based on material exposures. And the way we define materiality is how cyber threats, as well as incidents, introduce a negative condition on your business operations, your operational resiliency, and at the end of the day, your financial exposure. And if you think about the position of the SEC, it's really to preserve the integrity of our capital markets as an investor. So if I'm investing into said company, and let's say they realize a cyber attack, it costs them, I don't know, we'll make up a number, $250 million. I have an obligation, as the SEC, they have an obligation to provide that transparency as to, why that incident occurred without providing technical details, but more importantly, the so what factor. And the so what factor is it cost them $250 million. And so what are they doing to remediate it, and how do they develop policies, procedures, and engagement upstream to the board of directors to make sure that there's proper oversight. So that's really the intention behind the 2018 interpretive guidance, to bring cybersecurity risk management more as an enterprise risk management, focus in on materiality, which is the so what factor. How does it impact our business, our operations, and our financial exposure? And then anchor it into the executive suite and into the boardroom so that they're in a position to effectively oversee it. Less about the tech, more about the business resiliency and operational exposure. And then, it's positioning, it should position the CISO to be more effective, because now they're on the same page with the boardroom in terms of speaking the same language. And if the CISO requests, let's say, another $50 million incremental budget, there should be a constructive conversation around how that capital is being deployed to those areas that materially impact your business.
So Chris, and thank you for that. So I know you're not an SEC spokesperson, but
Yeah.
why wasn't the CISO put on the board? I mean, I felt like the disclosure rules stopped short of that. Can you give us your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I'd love to have, a portfolio of 5 or 6 boards to serve on, right? As we all would. So they did pull the commission as part of the new disclosure rule. So it went from interpretive guidance to a rule that is part of the Federal Register. So that's the difference is it's really more enforceable, right? It creates more accountability for the corporation, the company, its directors and officers, and it also opens up the aperture for class action suits if you violate these rules. So it's definitely a double down in terms of accountability. So they did pull the provision around mandating that you disclose, right, whether you have a cyber expert on your board or not, and how do you exercise that responsibility. So I'll tell you, there's two main points I'll shift towards. One is when we, within my NECD community role as their cyber risk advisor, my observation is that when there is a cyber expert, well, we'll just call it a technical expert, right? It could be technical, focused on AI, focused on cyber, pick the topic. It tends to get very narrowly focused on that particular technical subject. And if we think about the composition of the board, it's mostly comprised of, retired or former general counsels. There are accountants, CPAs, former CEOs, and they're not necessarily oriented towards that type of technical detail. So my observation within the NACD community, it shifts into a deep dive technical discussion, and then the balance of the board is totally removed. And that is a complete disconnect in terms of having effective oversight at the board level, because you want the entirety of the board rallied against this issue. That by the way, it's a material issue. So that was one reason why they pulled that out. The second is there's actually a benefit to have an outside expert retained by the board to serve as that cybersecurity expert. And we've seen this in other areas of discipline, such as compensation advisors. Compensation advisors that advise the board on executive C-suite compensation has been in industry for a number of decades. And these folks get pulled into the board on a quarterly basis. They're outside of the board, they're independent, and they evaluate the efficacy of the compensation. So I envision, and I'm seeing this, an emerging industry where the CISO community can have an opportunity in the boardroom, but as an outside advisor, independent of the board, independent of management. And in fact, the Delaware court systems suggest that it's best to have an outside expert.
So what do you think the CISO should be doing? What do you feel that their role really is at this point?
So look, I don't think it's changed since I was serving in the CISO role for GE Capital when we were a $500 billion bank back almost 15 years ago. It's really presenting the facts around where the exposures are from a technology hygiene perspective, where the process breakages are in terms of people, right? And having process and developing proper governance and bringing that upstream and presenting the facts to the executive suite and the board that, hey, we have these threats, we have these vulnerabilities, and here are the facts and circumstances around how these things could get exploited. And by the way, if they're exploited, here are the downstream impacts to our business, and present those facts to the executive suite and the board so that there's some decisioning around how much risk are we willing to accept, how much risk can we transfer using an optimized insurance policy. So that's where the CISO should be working very closely with the risk management organization And then the balance is, okay, so we've got this residual risk exposure. Where do we deploy capital and investments in order to reduce that risk, to address those areas that are most material to our business? And then the CISO working with technology, the business, enterprise risk management, their suppliers, it could be their security vendors, right? From a tooling standpoint, to optimize the deployment of that capital to reduce that exposure at the enterprise. Unfortunately, the CISO community is extremely overwhelmed with a preponderance of vendors and solutions that creates a ton of fragmentation, and that fragmentation creates risk exposure. So I think we're going to see consolidation in the cybersecurity market in terms of the tool set, which will benefit the CISO in order to execute their plan in a more effective way.
Well, we have started to see some consolidation, but the startup market's still going pretty strong. We're
Yeah.
almost out of time. I could have this conversation with you all day long because it's fascinating to get your perspective. But can you at least help us to end this session with giving the CISO some guidance on how to protect themselves in lieu of this SEC cyber disclosure rule?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I counsel many CISOs. So number one, full transparency, right, is key. If you see something, you say something, right? No different than, if I'm riding the subways in New York, there's always these signs: see something, say something, report it. Bring it forward in such a way that is understandable by the business. So, in other words, if you have a technology risk exposure, don't bring that risk exposure in the solution set to the business and the board through that technical lens. Bring it forward in a what I would call the so what factor, right? So if we don't have multi-factor deployed across, let's say, 90% of our company, we're going to realize XYZ type of results and express those results in business impact terms. It could introduce ransomware, which can cause a business interruption. It could introduce intellectual property theft, which can cause financial loss. And when they're making those decisions and communications, ensure that they have by their side somebody that can support that messaging, whether it be general counsel, right? It could be the CFO, it could be an outside advisor, right? And so bringing that so what factor into the conversation to support their mission towards protecting the enterprise and ensuring that the budget is in place. And then I would say, just secondly, since the liability aperture is starting to broaden, engage with inside counsel or outside counsel to pursue some type of directors and officers or D&O insurance so that they're personally covered. So I would say full transparency and ensure that you have the proper coverage. And oh, by the way, failed to mention this, since this is now a new rule, part of the Federal Register, there's a whistleblower program where the SEC will encourage individuals within the company and outside the company to bring forward this transparency directly to the SEC. So if
Thank
the
you.
CISO feels like they're not getting the right support, their messaging is being suppressed, they have an obligation and an opportunity to alert the regulators of such.
Thank you for that. We're out of time. If anyone wants to find you, how can they?
Just hit me up on LinkedIn. Christopher Hetner. I'm the guy with the American flag in the background. Still kept that image, but I'm sure once we finalize this webcast, we'll promote it through LinkedIn, and we'll make sure that we have the messaging out there across the community.
Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you being on this segment of Short Takes. Take
Thanks,
care.
Sue.